There are places on this planet that man was never meant to tread. The Arctic, a frozen expanse of isolation where the world's secrets lie buried beneath layers of ice older than time itself. When I set out on this journey, I thought I was chasing a story. A simple lead, sent to me in the form of a cryptic email, coordinates, a name, and a single sentence that I still can't forget. There is something beneath the ice. It was the kind of tip that piques a journalist's curiosity, and I had spent my life chasing the inexplicable. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to uncover. Nothing could have prepared me for the nightmares that would follow. The journey began like any other, a flight into the endless white void, a promise of danger and discovery. The Arctic is vast, an unbroken landscape of ice and silence. They say no one can hear you scream out here, and at the time I thought that was just melodrama. But there's truth in those words. Out here, where the air itself feels alive, every sound carries weight. Every whisper feels like it's crawling down your spine. And I wasn't alone in feeling it. Even my guide, a hardened local who had spent years traversing the tundra, seemed uneasy. I asked him what was wrong, and he just shook his head, muttering something under his breath. I didn't press him then, but looking back, I wish I had. We arrived at the coordinates on the third day. It wasn't marked on any map. No signs of human life for miles, except for the faint outline of a structure barely visible beneath the snow. At first, I thought it was an old research station, abandoned and forgotten. But as we drew closer, the details didn't add up. The steel-reinforced doors, the faint hum of machinery beneath the ice. This wasn't just a station. It was something else entirely. Something deliberate, purposeful, and yet it felt wrong. The air grew colder as we approached, and for the first time, I felt a knot of unease forming in my stomach. The door was locked, of course. No visible handles, no keypads. Just a smooth metallic surface that gleamed unnaturally in the faint Arctic light. My guide wanted to leave. He said it wasn't worth it, but I was stubborn. I'd come this far, and I wasn't about to turn back. That's when I noticed the hatch. Hidden beneath the snow, barely visible, it looked like an emergency entrance. With some effort, we managed to force it open, revealing a dark tunnel that stretched downward into the earth. The air that escaped was cold and stale, carrying with it a scent I couldn't quite place. Metallic, like rust, but with something else beneath it. Something that made my skin crawl. Against my guide's protests, I climbed down the ladder. The descent was longer than I expected, the darkness swallowing me whole. By the time my feet touched solid ground, I felt like I was in another world. The walls were lined with strange symbols, etched into the metal like some kind of forgotten language. My flashlight barely pierced the gloom, but what little it revealed was enough to send a chill through me. Footsteps. Not mine, but fresh prints in the dust, leading deeper into the facility. I called out, but my voice seemed to vanish into the void, swallowed by the oppressive silence. As I ventured further, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, and the faint hum I'd heard earlier was louder now, reverberating through the walls. It wasn't just machinery, it was something alive. And then I found the first room. It was small, cluttered with equipment that looked decades old, yet meticulously maintained. On the desk, a stack of documents lay scattered, written in a language I didn't recognize. But one word stood out, repeated over and over: containment. It didn't take a linguist to understand what it meant. That's when I heard it, a sound that I can only describe as wrong. It wasn't loud, just a faint scratching noise coming from somewhere deeper within the facility. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, something darting just beyond the edge of the light. My heart raced as I turned, but there was nothing there, just shadows and silence. I should have left then. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn back, to climb that ladder and seal the hatch behind me. But I couldn't. Curiosity, arrogance, whatever you want to call it, it pushed me forward. I followed the sound, deeper into the labyrinth of corridors, each step taking me further from the surface, further from safety. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. The walls were no longer metal, but something else entirely. Organic, pulsing, and the hum was deafening now, like a heartbeat echoing through my skull. When I finally reached the source of the sound, I froze. There, in the center of a massive chamber, was something. It's hard to describe, even now. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely alien either. A grotesque fusion of flesh and machinery, pulsating with a sickly light. It didn't move, not at first, but as I stepped closer, I swear I saw it breathe. I suppose I should explain how I ended up here in this frozen nightmare. It wasn't random. Nothing about this was random. My name is Daniel Reese. I've spent the last 10 years as an investigative journalist, chasing the stories most people would prefer stayed buried. Corruption, conspiracies, secrets. They've always fascinated me. Call it an obsession if you want. But this time, the story found me. It started with an email. Anonymous sender, no subject line, just coordinates and a message. The truth is beneath the ice. At first I thought it was a prank, the kind of thing people send to waste your time. But then I checked the coordinates. A remote section of the Arctic, hundreds of miles from any known settlement. The kind of place you'd only go if you were hiding something. And then there was the name. The email was signed off with a single word, Chimera. I didn't know what it meant, not then, but it was enough to spark my curiosity, enough to make me pack my bags and book the next flight north. I wasn't completely unprepared. The Arctic is unforgiving, and I'd done my research. Layers of thermal clothing, survival gear, a satellite phone for emergencies. And of course, I hired a guide, Lars. He'd lived in the region his whole life, knew the terrain better than anyone. But even he seemed uneasy about this trip. He asked me why I wanted to go to such a desolate place. I didn't give him the full truth, just enough to satisfy his curiosity. Still, I could tell he wasn't convinced. The journey was brutal. Freezing winds that cut through even the thickest layers, endless white stretching in every direction, and a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped. It was beautiful, in a way, but also deeply unsettling. And then there were the stories. Lars told me about the lights. Strange, multicolored orbs that danced across the sky, but not like the northern lights. These were different, closer, almost alive. He spoke of shadows moving across the ice, shadows with no source. I laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to local superstition. But now, I'm not so sure. By the time we reached the coordinates, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. But the sight of that structure, it sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. This wasn't just some abandoned outpost. It was something far more significant. And as I stood there, staring at the entrance, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Lars refused to go any further. He said he'd wait outside, but even that promise felt hollow. He knew, just as I did, that whatever was in there, it wasn't meant to be found. As I stepped into the tunnel, the world I knew fell away. The walls were smooth, unnaturally so, their metallic surface cold to the touch. Each footstep echoed into the void, a sound that seemed to stretch longer than it should, like the space itself was shifting. The air carried a metallic tang, sharp and invasive, like breathing in rust. And the cold, it wasn't just the Arctic cold. This was something else, deeper, like the facility itself was alive and leaching warmth from everything inside. The flashlight's beam struggled against the oppressive darkness, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. The further I went, the more it felt like the walls were pressing in, constricting my path, forcing me forward rather than giving me the option to turn back. And that hum, it had followed me from the surface, growing louder with each step, resonating deep in my chest like an ominous heartbeat. At first, the signs of abandonment seemed ordinary. A toppled chair here, a broken light fixture there. But then I saw the claw marks. Long, jagged gashes etched into the steel walls, as if something with unimaginable strength had tried to tear its way through. They were fresh, the edges still gleaming, untouched by the dust that clung to everything else. My pulse quickened as I ran my fingers along the grooves, each one deeper than my hand could fit. Whatever made these marks, it was still here, somewhere. The corridor branched into a labyrinth of hallways, each more disorienting than the last. Some led to dead ends, others to rooms filled with old, decaying equipment, monitors that flickered to life as I passed, displaying static and, for brief moments, shapes that looked too human to be coincidences. The whispers began not long after, faint at first like a distant conversation, but growing louder as I moved deeper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, accusatory, warning, pleading. I called out, half hoping for a response and half dreading it, but the whispers faded the moment my voice broke the silence, leaving me alone with the growing certainty that I wasn't alone at all. Then there was the room with the glass walls. It was massive, stretching further than my flashlight could illuminate. Inside were rows of empty chambers, each one stained with something dark and viscous. The glass was thick, reinforced, yet riddled with cracks that spread like spider webs. One chamber caught my eye. It wasn't empty. There was something inside, a shape curled in the corner, too distorted to be human but eerily close. Its chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, each exhale fogging the glass. My hand trembled as I reached out, the glass cold beneath my fingers. And then it moved. Not towards me, not immediately. It twitched, its head snapping up, eyes, or what I think were eyes, fixing on mine. They weren't human, but they were filled with something I recognized, fear. And then the thing screamed. It wasn't a sound, it was an assault, a visceral, bone-deep noise that shook the walls and sent my flashlight flickering wildly. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet as the glass cracked further. It didn't break, not yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time. I ran. I didn't care about the whispers anymore, or the claw marks, or the shadows that seemed to dance at the edges of my vision. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they'd give out. And that's when I found the elevator. It wasn't marked, just a simple steel door with a panel beside it. The buttons glowed faintly, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness around me. My hand hovered over them, hesitating. The idea of going deeper was madness, but the way back, it didn't feel safe anymore. Before I could decide, the doors opened on their own. The light inside was blinding, stark and sterile, a jarring shift from the dim corridors. I stepped in, driven more by the need to escape than any sense of bravery. The doors slid shut behind me with a finality that made my stomach twist. The panel lit up, the buttons shifting to symbols I couldn't read, glowing faintly against the metallic surface. And then the elevator began to descend. It wasn't a smooth ride. The hum that had been following me was deafening now, punctuated by deep, rhythmic thuds like the heartbeat of a slumbering giant. The air grew colder with every passing second, frost creeping along the walls of the elevator. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, each exhale visible in the freezing air. When the elevator finally stopped, the silence was almost worse. The doors opened to reveal a cavernous space, impossibly large, its walls lined with strange machinery that pulsed with an eerie light. In the center was a massive structure, unlike anything I'd ever seen, organic yet mechanical, its surface writhing as if alive. And there were figures, dozens of them, standing motionless around it. At first, I thought they were statues, but as I stepped closer, I realized they were encased in some kind of translucent material. Their faces were twisted in terror, mouths open in silent screams. Some wore uniforms, others lab coats, all of them frozen in a moment of pure horror. That's when the ground began to tremble, and the hum shifted into something more, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The figures in the encasements began to move, their eyes snapping open in unison, all of them turning to face me. And then, from the shadows, something else emerged, something that made me wish I had never opened that hatch. The first signs of something terribly wrong came early. As I made my way deeper into the facility, the temperature dropped even further, unnatural for a structure built to withstand Arctic extremes. My breath crystallized instantly, and the frost lining the walls grew thicker with every step. Then I found the first anomaly, a handprint, stark red against the frozen metal. It wasn't just blood, it was fresh, The sharp contrast of crimson against the frost was impossible to miss. But whose was it? I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. I followed the trail it left behind, smudges on the walls, faint impressions in the frost-covered floor. The prints led me to a room that looked like a command center. Consoles blinked with faint lights, screens filled with static and occasional flashes of text in a language I didn't recognize. On the main console lay a logbook, its pages weathered but intact. I opened it carefully, the paper stiff with age, and began to read. The entries described experiments, things that should never have been attempted, references to unknown biological entities and phrases like adaptive cellular integration. At first, it was all scientific jargon, incomprehensible to anyone outside a lab. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. The entries grew erratic, frantic. Day 47, subject exhibits rapid growth, uncontrollable, containment compromised. Day 58, crew member 17 missing, presumed assimilation. Day 63, they are learning. The last entry was scrawled across the page in shaky handwriting. To whoever finds this, seal the hatch. Do not let them out. I barely had time to process what I'd read when I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the corridor I'd just walked down. My flashlight beam wavered as my hands shook, the light bouncing off the metallic walls and creating shifting shadows. I called out, my voice cracking, but no one answered. The footsteps stopped. I waited, straining to hear, but all that greeted me was silence, a suffocating, oppressive silence. Then the alarm blared. It wasn't just a simple warning siren. It was a cacophony of overlapping sounds, high-pitched wails, guttural roars, and a rhythmic pounding that seemed to vibrate the very floor beneath me. The lights flickered wildly, plunging the room into chaos. I grabbed the logbook and ran, the deafening noise chasing me down the corridor. Every shadow seemed alive, every flicker of light revealing something I didn't want to see. And then I saw it, just for a moment, something darting at the edge of the flashlight's beam. It moved with an unnatural speed, a blur of limbs and shifting shapes that didn't match anything I'd ever seen before. It was gone before I could fully register what it was, but the primal fear it left in its wake was unmistakable. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead, frozen in place by the crushing weight of terror. Finally, I forced myself to move, stumbling down the corridor toward what I hoped was safety. I reached another door, this one marked with faded warnings in multiple languages. The scratches on the surface were deep, almost as if something had been trying to claw its way out rather than in. My hand hesitated on the handle, every fiber of my being screaming to turn back. But there was nowhere else to go. The room beyond was vast, lined with rows of containment pods. Most were shattered, their glass panels hanging in jagged shards. Whatever had been inside was long gone, but the signs of their presence were everywhere. Deep gouges in the walls, strange, viscous fluids pooling on the floor. I stepped carefully, trying not to make a sound, but the silence was short-lived. Behind me, one of the intact pods began to hiss. A thin stream of vapor escaped from the seals, and the lights inside flickered to life. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The figure inside was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its skin translucent and pulsating with faint bioluminescent veins. Its eyes, or the voids where eyes should have been, snapped open, fixing on me with an intelligence that felt predatory. The hiss grew louder, and the pod began to open. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted, crashing through the rows of broken glass and debris. Behind me I heard the sound of something emerging, a wet, slithering noise that sent a fresh wave of panic through me. The facility was alive now, lights flickering erratically, machinery roaring to life, and that deafening hum echoing through every corridor. And then as I rounded a corner, I saw the figure. Not the creature from the pod, but something else. A man. At least, I think it was a man. He stood perfectly still, his face obscured by a hooded parka, but his presence was undeniable. I called out to him, desperate for help, but he didn't respond. He just raised a hand, pointing to something behind me. I turned, and that's when I saw it. The creature from the pod was no longer alone. Others had emerged, their grotesque forms filling the corridor, blocking any hope of escape. Their movements were erratic but deliberate, their bodies shifting and reshaping in ways that defied explanation. I turned back to the hooded figure, but he was gone. Only the faint outline of his footprints remained in the frost, and then the lights went out. I stood in the vast chamber, paralyzed by the grotesque thing before me. It was alive, an abomination of flesh, metal, and something else I couldn't comprehend. Tubes and wires snaked in and out of its body, pulsating like veins under the surface of its translucent, leathery skin. Its mass seemed to breathe, each rise and fall releasing a faint, acrid mist that filled the room with a sharp, chemical tang. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. It wasn't just alien. It felt wrong on a level that defied explanation, like looking at something the human mind wasn't equipped to understand. Scattered around the room were what I can only describe as relics of the unimaginable. Glass containers filled with murky fluids and dismembered forms suspended within. Some human, others not. Walls covered in what looked like hieroglyphics, etched into the metal with precision far beyond anything I'd seen before. It wasn't just a laboratory, it was a shrine, a temple to something ancient and terrifying. I moved closer, drawn in despite every instinct screaming at me to run. That's when I saw it, the monitors, dozens of them, flickering to life as I approached. They displayed images, grainy footage of experiments conducted in this very chamber. Men and women strapped to tables, wires connected to their skulls, their faces contorted in expressions of unimaginable pain. Voices crackled through unseen speakers, speaking in fragmented sentences. Test subject unresponsive. Neural degradation at 80%. Proceed with phase 2. And then the screen shifted to something worse, a live feed, showing the chamber I was standing in from an angle high above. On the screen I saw myself, standing there frozen in place, and just behind me, something moved. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand, but there was nothing, only shadows dancing on the pulsating walls. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it like a pressure in the air, a weight bearing down on my chest, and then it spoke. Not with words, but with thoughts that weren't mine. A voice, cold and calculating, drilling into my mind. You should not be here. My knees buckled under the weight of its presence. Images flooded my mind, flashes of other worlds, barren landscapes littered with the bones of creatures I couldn't name. A sense of overwhelming despair, as if the universe itself was screaming in agony. And then I understood. This thing, this organism, it wasn't just alive. It was sentient, a collector of fear, feeding off the terror of its victims, growing stronger with each life it consumed. And I was next. The monitors blared to life again, alarms shrieking as red lights bathed the chamber in an eerie glow. A voice, robotic and emotionless, echoed through the facility. Containment breach. Facility lockdown initiated. The walls began to tremble, the hum I'd heard before now a deafening roar. The organism stirred, its massive form shifting as cables and tubes detached, like a predator awakening from a long slumber. I ran. There was no plan, no direction, just a desperate need to escape. The corridors blurred together as I sprinted, the sound of machinery and distant footsteps. No, not footsteps, something heavier, growing louder behind me. I reached an elevator, its doors already open, and threw myself inside. As it ascended, the walls shuddered violently, sparks raining down from exposed wires. I didn't know where it was taking me. I didn't care. Anywhere was better than there. The elevator came to an abrupt halt, throwing me to the floor. The doors opened to reveal another nightmare. This level wasn't abandoned. It was alive. Tendrils of that same pulsating material from the chamber covered the walls, throbbing in rhythm with the deafening hum. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the floor was slick with some unidentifiable fluid. And then I heard it, a guttural growl, low and menacing, echoing from the darkness. I wasn't alone. A figure emerged, but it wasn't human, not anymore. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its body twisted and warped as if molded by the organism itself. Its eyes, glowing faintly, locked onto mine, and it let out a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a roar. I turned and ran, my breath ragged, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. The thing chased me, its footsteps pounding like thunder, its snarls echoing through the corridors. The exit was close. I could see the faint light of the hatch at the end of the hall. But the facility wasn't done with me yet. The floor buckled beneath me, a massive crack splitting the ground as the organism's tendrils burst through, reaching for me. I dodged, barely keeping my balance, and lunged for the ladder. Climbing felt like an eternity, each rung slick with ice and trembling beneath my weight. I didn't dare look down. The thing was still there, its inhuman growls growing louder as it clawed its way after me. Finally, I reached the surface, throwing myself out of the hatch and into the blinding white of the Arctic wasteland. The air was bitterly cold, but it was a relief after the suffocating atmosphere below. I turned to seal the hatch, my hands trembling, but before I could, a massive explosion erupted from beneath the ice. The ground shook violently, and I was thrown backward, landing hard in the snow. The hatch was gone, swallowed by a sinkhole that collapsed in on itself, taking the facility, and whatever was inside, back into the earth. I lay there, staring at the sky, too exhausted to move. The silence returned, broken only by the howling wind. Whatever that thing was, it was buried again, for now. But as I looked out at the endless expanse of white, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that it was still down there waiting, watching. And then I saw them. Lights in the sky. Not the northern lights, but something else, something closer, something alive. I clawed my way across the snow, each movement sending searing pain through my body. My breath came in ragged gasps, the freezing air burning my lungs. Behind me, the ground was still trembling, and that horrible hum, the heartbeat of the thing beneath the ice, was growing fainter. But it wasn't gone. I knew that much. It was never truly gone. The hatch had vanished, swallowed by the collapsing facility, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped. Not entirely. The lights in the sky danced again, casting unnatural colors across the frozen landscape, and I felt their pull. It was as if they were trying to guide me, or perhaps mock me, reminding me that the secrets I had uncovered could never truly be left behind. I made it back to the outpost where Lars was waiting, his face pale with fear. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. We both knew that whatever I had found beneath the ice had changed me. I could feel it, a heaviness in my chest, a whisper at the back of my mind. We didn't speak on the journey back. The silence between us was filled with unspoken questions, and I could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't believe I had escaped, not really, and neither did I. Months have passed since that day, but the nightmares haven't stopped. I wake up in a cold sweat, the hum still echoing in my ears, the lights dancing in the corners of my vision. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and still, I swear I hear it calling my name. I've tried to move on, to bury the memories of what I saw, but the truth has a way of resurfacing. The artifact I recovered, a small metallic object etched with the same strange symbols I saw in the facility, sits on my desk, a constant reminder of the horrors I uncovered. I've tried to destroy it, to throw it away, but it always finds its way back. And now, as I stare at it, I realize the nightmare isn't over, it's just beginning. I've told you my story, but I know it doesn't end here. Not really. The Arctic holds its secrets well, but how long until someone else stumbles upon them? How long until they dig too deep, venture too far, and wake something that was meant to remain buried? And now I ask you, what would you have done? Would you have turned back at the first sign of danger, or would curiosity have pulled you forward? Could you resist the allure of the unknown, knowing it might cost you everything? As for the artifact, I still have it, locked away, hidden where no one else can find it. But sometimes when I hold it, I swear I can feel it pulsing, like it's alive, like it's waiting. Tell me, do you think it's still alive down there, waiting for the ice to melt? Or was it all in my head, a trick of the isolation and cold? Let me know what you think, because I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over, that it's just the beginning. If you've made it this far, you're part of this now. Keep your eyes open and your mind sharp. The truth is out there, buried in places we fear to go, and sometimes the cost of knowing is far greater than the comfort of ignorance. So what do you think? Would you have gone looking, or would you have left it all buried beneath the ice? I survived, yes, but survival isn't the same as escape, and some nights when the wind howls just right, I hear it, that hum, faint but persistent, calling my name, and I wonder, did I really leave it behind, or did it follow me home?